As we proceed into an era of climate crisis, many of us have been holding in our hearts the wish for community weaving and have had living harmoniously with our surroundings on our minds. We're realizing the importance of weaving regional resilience. We are exploring these new avenues and possibilities. We're thinking about questions like, how can we live in place-based ways of living? How can we develop bioregional communities that are kin-centric, living in relationship with the landscapes they are situated in, and the non-human beings that share that landscape? What does eco-centric living entail? But the crisis is not just climactic. It is also a crisis of community, imagination, care, trust, meaning, relationship, and nervous system regulation. That is why socio-ecological initiatives recognize that collapse is happening both on the earth and within people, and that we must tend to the environment as much as we must tend to each other. We need socio-ecological approaches for remembering and rediscovering the kinds of communities that live in intimate relationship with nature. In some circles, this process is being called re-indigenization or rewilding. These terms go beyond being wild and free. They embrace responsibility as a primary life orientation. They seek out belonging to a landscape and a kin-centric model of community. And they follow the laws of reciprocity and collective responsibility. Foresnauts proposes a sociological approach to explore the return to kin-centric communities, collectives that exist within and not above the matrix of living systems we are embedded in, where the needs of the surrounding landscape and other beings of nature are considered as much as those of human beings. And Foresnauts recognize that we do not have all of the knowledge of how to live in kinship and collaborative association with nature. Much ancestral wisdom has been lost. There is therefore a need for an open process without preconceived ideas of what an ecocentric, place-based or kin-centric community should be or look like. An approach that seeks to remember and rediscover relational knowledge with the land and among people through an experimental and experiential process. Foresnauts are navigators, seeking new worlds, but also midwives of these new planets that emerge from the Earth. Rather than exploring in space, Foresnauts explore in time, allowing these new worlds, which consist of both human and non-human, to develop according to their own nature, rather than replicating modernity's patterns of hurry and hustle, scheduled planning, and controlled outcomes. There's so much discussion and information out there about personal growth, the development of the authentic self, and the search for individual purpose. The modern era has focused on the individual, and much has been learned, but for whatever reason, the same amount of energy has not been put into methods for the creation and development of the group as a collective being. Foresnauts, or Bosquenautas in Spanish, have the intention of experimenting with collective development. And in order to figure out what it means to be a kin-centric community, we need people willing to start out as a handful of individuals and lean into uncharted paths that lead from individuality to community. And since there's no single recipe or roadmap, nor individual expert who can show the way, we've got to figure it out together. We want to myceliate a concrescence, where people come together into a greater organism by weaving connections between the human and non-human. We recognize that each group, culture, community, organization, collective, and place will discover its own way of forming kin-centric communities based on the needs and capacities of the group, local ecology, and the structural and systemic circumstances they find themselves in. This kind of community doesn't just live sustainably. It also tends to the needs of its members, human, plant, animal, fungi, non-organic, and the forces of the elements. Without knowing the exact path forward towards kin-centric community, or there being a definitive version of one to aim for, What Foresnauts is about is trying to figure out how to figure it out. The suffix "naut" comes from the Greek word for navigator. So while Foresnauts are navigating towards these new worlds, the route always shifts depending on the currents and weather conditions. We don't have a fixed plan or a completed model. This project isn't about teaching or handing down a definitive model. It's about discovering them together and seeing how each route unfolds. Since the new worlds they are trying to discover do not yet exist, the possibilities for these worlds and the paths for reaching them are as varied as evolution and biodiversity themselves. Thus, socio-ecological organizational work is something to be discovered collectively and in a manner appropriate to each context, where every community, organization, collective, and place can approach it in their own way. And while we don't know the exact way forward, Foresnauts can offer some principles that can guide us and a socio-ecological web cycle of change that shows what the journey might look like. The 4 principles of Foresnauts act as a compass needle that point towards kincentricity. These principles have been inspired by groups across the world doing socio-ecological and decolonial work, whose activism is rooted in an indigenous worldview and their lived experiences of life in kin-centric societies. The Foresnauts web cycle is a feedback loop of what a transformative process might look like for a community. It is inspired by peoples who used theater as a tool for societal change and who took cultural cues from the natural world around them. These models are meant as a first draft, an inspiration for your own socio-ecological work, something to spark conversation or help get us started. And throughout this channel, I'll be exploring various topics related to the socio-ecological process, explaining terms, giving examples, offering possibilities and personal experiences, and also addressing caveats, pitfalls, and blind spots that arise in socio-ecological work. Yet this account is not primarily meant to teach or influence. It is meant to find and foster collaboration with those who do socio-ecological work or want to, who resonate with this process and these values and want to figure it out together. This account and project is like a campfire for sitting with the questions, without rushing towards answers or solutions. There are possibilities that need time to emerge, and when we just sit, we allow space for new socio-ecological iterations that might not have occurred to us before to reach us from the surrounding darkness. So please feel free to reach out, engage, share experiences, ask questions, and make relationship.